Gentlemen, a lot of you have heard of the Riepe family sabbatical, and this year we're fortunate in the upper school that last year's recipient of the sabbatical is our own Dr. Kelly. And he's going to present to us today on how he spent the second semester of last year on sabbatical and share that experience with us today. Before I turn it over to Dr. Kelly, though, I wanted to acknowledge and introduce Mr. and Mrs. Riepe, who are responsible for making this sabbatical opportunity possible for our faculty. So thank you all very much for being here. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Riepes and how this sabbatical came to be. So Mr. Riepe, Jim Riepe, is a past parent. His son, Jamie, or their son, Jamie, graduated in 1994 and lives in Washington, D.C. right now. Mr. Riepe is currently the non-executive chairman of the board of Genworth Financial, where he's been a director since 2006. In addition, he is a retired vice chairman and a senior advisor at T. Rowe Price and a director of NASDAQ OMX Group, which is a parent company to the stock exchange. Mr. Riepe has also served as the director of T. Rowe Price Group Incorporated. He's married to Gail, Mrs. Riepe, to all of us, and is the father of Jamie, as I said a little while ago, and a daughter, Christina. Did she, Bryn Mawr, Roland Park, Garrison Forest. Mr. Riepe earned a BS in Industrial Management and an MBA, and received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree, all from the University of Pennsylvania. And while he was an undergrad there, he was captain of the football team. And the Riepes established the Riepe sabbatical, the Riepe family sabbatical, in February of 1999 to reward consistent excellence in teaching and to promote the continuing educational development of our faculty. And what this means is the fund that they set up, that they established, allows one faculty member per year to have a semester sabbatical at full pay plus a stipend, which covers travel and related expenses. And so a typical proposal allows a faculty member to engage in some kind of research to continue their education, to allow them to recharge their batteries, and to pursue something of interest to them. In addition to the financial support that the Riepes have provided by setting up this fund, as well as the Riepe Family Exchange Fund, which helps make our British exchanges happen, Mr. Riepe served as a trustee at Gilman and was chair of the Board of Trustees, president of the Board of Trustees back in the 90s. He's currently a member, I'm not sure if you currently are a member of Penn or not, a member of the Pennsylvania Board of Trustees, University of Pennsylvania Board of Trustees, and served as its president, and is also a trustee of the Baltimore Museum of Art and the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Foundation. Pretty cool. And then Mr. and Ms. Riepe live in Baltimore County, and their son Jamie, who's a Gilman alum, lives down in D.C. now, and they have two daughters at the school where I used to work, which is kind of a nice coincidence. So, with all of that, I want to thank the Riepes for being here. I want to thank them for making this kind of opportunity possible for our faculty. Just so you know, some of the past recipients of the Riepe sabbatical include our own Mr. Connolly, Mr. Gaby, Mr. Jacobs, Ms. Trapp, Mr. Christian, Dr. Thornberry, Mr. Sawinski, and Anton Vishio, Mr. Vishio, who retired a few years ago. There's also some lower school and middle school teachers who received the award. Last year it was Dr. Kelly, and without further ado, I will turn it over to him.
Good morning. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Riepe and Gilman, for giving me the opportunity to really fulfill a lifelong dream. Many of the faculty here are old enough to remember the Vietnam War growing up during that era, and I was one of those people. And many of our friends would be drafted. We would have parties for them. We would have funerals and wakes when they didn't make it back. and we would have parties when they did come back. And when I went to the university, I saw that I believe that the war was not really portrayed in the way that I saw it, and pretty much in the center of it in New York City. I was able to go to protests, watch them really. I was your age. Vietnam War, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I had many friends who marched on City Hall when Kent State happened, and the mayor put the flag at half-mast. And these men were upset that it wasn't at half-mast all the time for their sons. So my whole life I really wanted to visit Vietnam, and I visited many, many museums throughout my career as an historian, and most of the museums did not have a viable presentation on the Vietnam War. And when I would ask the archivists and the like at the Smithsonian and others, they would say it's too political. So my proposal was to visit all of the federally funded museums in the United States, just federal. There are a lot of state and local ones that have different views, and to see how they portray the Vietnam War. And then I wanted to go to Vietnam and go to the museums there and see how they portray the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is alive and well in politics. Just an example. Clinton versus Bush, the first time. Clinton was drafted. He took a one-year deferment and went to Oxford, and then decided that he wasn't coming back. George Bush joined the National Guard, which was very difficult to get into, and served in the National Guard, but was also worked on political campaigns. And both candidates attacked each other for that. In Bush versus Gore, the campaign said that Gore, who had volunteered for the military, was given preferential treatment because his father was a senator. Bush versus Kerry. John Kerry has a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, but again, politics came into play and argued that he didn't deserve those medals. In Bush versus McCain, in the Southern primaries when they were running for president, the argument was that McCain was unstable because of all of his years in the prisoner of war camp, which I will show you in my presentation. So my thesis is that the war is still being fought, and it's being fought by people who don't want to let go, don't want to admit it, that the United States lost the war. They'll make many reasons why we, quote, didn't lose the war. And I'm not here to prove one side or the other. I just want to present what I found in these museums. And I will go from there. These are pictures that my generation grew up with. These are the images of the Vietnam War. This Buddhist set himself on fire in protest. His car, that car is in his, they have a wonderful place in the museum for that, and he is credited with a lot of bringing the people to believe that Vietnam could be free, both from the French and from other countries. This is a grotesque picture of photographers taking pictures of a dead Vietnamese. It was in all the newspapers. This is a young girl who was hit by napalm during a raid. This again is probably the most popular, the worst picture you could ever imagine. This is a picture taken by Life magazine photographer just before a Vietnamese general blew this Viet Cong's head off. This is Jane Fonda, who many may see in movies and the like, and again representing the protest and the like. She went to Hanoi, where many, many prisoners of war were kept in a Hanoi Hilton, and sat in an anti-aircraft position that had shot down one of the B-52s. This is a famous photograph, again from Life magazine, showing Vietnamese peasants hiding from an attack from the air. This is towards the end of the war, when the United States had already left, and those people who have helped the United States are trying to get into the American embassy. Many of them did not make it into the American Embassy. I was with one family whose father was sent to a re-education camp for 11 years, who had worked for the United States. Many others were sent for 10 or 15 years to re-education camps, all because they worked for the United States. Again, another picture of the end of the war. This, again, is a picture that most people who lived through the era would remember. Helicopter pilots would fly to the aircraft carriers and dump their people off, and there was no room to keep the helicopters, so they would push them aside. My guide, Tam, his father was a U.S. helicopter pilot. He was one of the people who fled to the aircraft carriers and now lives in Pennsylvania. This is the most famous picture in Vietnam of the end of the war, and it shows a North Vietnamese tank going into the presidential palace. Now this is a newspaper obituary that was in Sunday's newspaper. It's Nguyen Giap. Giap was the George Washington of his country. He defeated both the French and the Americans. And as you can see, who ousted the U.S. from Vietnam. So at least the New York Times is arguing that the United States was ousted from Vietnam. The Amazing Race, just before I left in March, the Amazing Race was in Hanoi. And they had, part of it was shown at the B-52 Museum. And again, veterans groups and others argued that this was dishonorable to those men who had served, who had died, who had been shot down over Vietnam. And they offered to maybe that CBS should have a discussion about that rather than the B-52 Museum. This is what the commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars said. B-52s and the war with B-52s, the Vietnamese take great pride in the fact that they were able to shoot down 17 American B-52s. There's a museum of that. This is, it's in the middle of Hanoi, and most of the documents in that museum are American documents. They're not Vietnamese documents, and they explain quite substantially how it is that they were able to shoot down the American planes. So the thesis is the battle for the legacy of the Vietnam War is still being played and waged in public spaces. The only museum that I found in America that dealt with Vietnam in a, put it into context or in historical context was West Point. I visited the Kennedy Museum, the Presidential Museum, I visited the Truman Museum, the Annapolis, the War College, and all of those, they only dealt with Vietnam POWs. They didn't put it into context. It was always an argument that look what our POWs had to go through. The anti-personnel mines used in Vietnam, a crude example of what happened, as you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, West Point showing the women who served in Vietnam, what they went through and the like. These are the famous punji sticks that were rubbed into human excrement. Soldiers would step on them, get terrible wounds, and had to be taken off the field. It's again the West Point view on Vietnam. They put it into context, and now we move on to Vietnam, which is very, very interesting to go there and to see this. This is a statue in a lake in Hanoi depicting the rescue of Senator McCain when he was shot down. It's in the center of the city. 1967, he is shot down, and the lake is now called Lake McCain. I found that quite strange when I was there. He was a POW. He was tortured for years, 6 years, and they put a statue about his rescue. This picture is everywhere in Vietnam. It is Senator McCain again being rescued. The North Vietnamese had not seen many Americans. The war was being fought in the South. So the only Americans that the North Vietnamese will see are those that they shoot down and capture. Senator McCain is key to the past of Vietnam and the present of Vietnam. This is Senator McCain returning to the Hanoi Hilton. This is a museum now in Hanoi where the American prisoners were kept, tortured, unspeakable harm was done to them. The museum does not go into that at all. What the museum does go into is how the French tortured the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong before the Americans. So that was something that I spoke to the archivist there about it, and their argument was that the American section of the war was just a small part of the war for liberation, and that we paid far too much attention to those 5, 6, 7 years that POWs were kept in the Hanoi Hilton. We should pay more attention to the other side. This is the Hanoi Hilton in 1972. As you can see, it's a very large complex. Right now, it's about a half of that. The other half was a hotel was put in its place. Hanoi is booming. The war is very well behind them as far as economics and the like, but it's still in the mindset of everybody you talk to. This is in the center of Hanoi. It's Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of Vietnam. He died in 1969. It was his wish that his ashes be spread through the mountains, the sea, and the highlands. The party did not do that. They kept him in a cave for many years and then embalmed him, much like Lenin. So you can go to the mausoleum and see him. I was in Hanoi for Reunification Day and for May Day, and I was given the opportunity to interview many, many people who had fought the Americans. And I will say that they all welcomed me. They welcome all Americans. It's quite strange when that first happens, but it happens throughout the country. And what they say is that your country, the people who fought the war, were brought here under duress. They're talking about the draft. And that your people recognize that it was an unjust war. This is their view of it. So they welcome Americans everywhere. They want to know about America. They want to learn English. They want to stay with you when they're practicing their English. And the line on Unification Day for the Ho Chi Minh Trail was 11 hours. People would wait on line. He's deified in Vietnam. 11 hours they would wait in line just to pass his corpse. These are all over Vietnam. Anywhere you go, signs of Uncle Ho. Uncle Ho loved children, so he is the uncle of everybody. Both the North and the South adore Ho. It's the one person that they could both agree on. Think of the South after the Civil War, and the Northerners control it. The Southerners in Vietnam all feel that the Northerners control all the best jobs and the like. That if Uncle Ho was still here, things would be better. That doesn't make them anti-Vietnam or anything like that, or even anti-communist. They're all nationalists, but they do not like the fact that much of the South is controlled, in their view, manipulated by those politicians in the north. This is the city of Hue. If anybody ever watched Full Metal Jacket or any other Vietnamese movie about the Vietnam War, you will see this used, portrayed. It is the citadel. It is huge. It's about 40 blocks wide, and the damage from the war is still there. It's everywhere. They're trying to fix it, but as you can see, these are all holes shot by the Americans to get in. The Viet Cong took over Hue. It was the bloodiest battle in the Vietnam War. They were able to sustain themselves for about 2.5 weeks before they were driven out. This woman is a survivor of a massacre, a war crime that the United States troops committed during the Vietnam War. It happened in a village called My Lai. And they have a museum at My Lai depicting the atrocities that Americans committed. This is a line of coffins and memorials. And these are the depictions inside the My Lai Museum. Now, the interesting aspect of this was it's the only place I found propaganda. Most of the museums in Vietnam use American documents to bolster their argument. In the case of My Lai, and this was very interesting too, it was in Vietnamese, it wasn't in English. I asked my translator to translate it for me, and it was that the Americans that day had secret orders to kill everybody. And in fact, they did not have secret orders to kill anybody. When I spoke to an expert on this, they said actually they did because it was a free fire zone. That anybody in this area could be considered an enemy and could be killed. So the depiction is a bit, it's not as modern as we would like it, but the Vietnamese go to this temple, go to this memorial regularly, at least once a year. They try to get there, and it is a very, very big event in their culture. These are the citadels for those, these are the monuments for those who have fallen. You find them all over Vietnam, from north to south. I drove the entire country. I was there for about 6.5 weeks. You see these everywhere. They're for those bodies that weren't recovered from the Viet Cong. And you'll find them all over the south. It's amazing how many you will find. And this is the War Remnants Museum. And the War Remnants Museum is where the Vietnamese make their case that the war was unjust and that the Americans committed war crimes. Again, they only use American documents, Nixon papers, Pentagon papers, NSC papers. A bunch of soldiers have sent their medals to the different museums, and again, the Vietnamese use this as proof or propaganda, depending on the way you want to see it. So most of their evidence comes from American media and the like, and they make quite a good use of it. These were the cages that the Viet Cong were kept in when they were captured by the Americans. Underneath the largest army base in Vietnam were the tunnels of Cu Chi. They ran for 200 miles underneath the country. Think of wiping out a village and thinking it's gone, but actually it's 40 feet underground and people are still living there. And after the war, they're going to come back up. And they lived underneath there. They fought underneath there. There are some caverns that can fit up to 1,200 people. They had hospitals down there. Entire villages lived in these tunnels. These are some of the traps that were there to make sure that nobody got near them. And this is how well they are camouflaged. Now think, this is all, there's no foliage here, but think of this under the jungle, green jungle. Right across from there, in an anthill, would be a machine gun, all covered with jungle. Again, they have these tanks and military equipment all over the country showing their victory, their famous victory over the Americans. And finally, the B-52 Museum. The B-52 Museum is in the center of Hanoi. Everybody knows how many B-52s were knocked down. Dien Bien Phu was a famous battle that pushed the French out of Vietnam, and the Vietnamese believe that the battle on the B-52s was their Dien Bien Phu against the United States. These are just some pictures from 1972, give you some idea of the damage and the destruction that the bombs created. This is what the people would climb into to try to protect themselves from the bombs. As you can well imagine, it didn't protect them too much. This is a very important artifact in the museum. It's Pete Peterson's plane. Pete Peterson will be held as a prisoner of war for over 5 years, and he will become the first ambassador to Vietnam, opening up the way for American trade and American recognition of Vietnam. These are the B-52s laying around that you can see at the museum. Again, commerce is there. There's the Cafe B-52, and it's in this neighborhood that has parts of a B-52 in their lake. So you can sit there and look at the different parts. Again, this is the B-52. This final picture is a group of students that I spent 2 or 3 days with in Saigon, trying to learn what it was that they were looking for about America, and all of them look to America for leadership. They look to America for the future, and none of them are looking backwards, nor are their grandparents or their parents. They're all looking forward, and they're very, very friendly to Americans, and the war is behind them. So my hope is that the war also is behind in the United States, and we can put it behind us as this generation either dies or comes to realization that the war is over. Thank you.